So hi everyone, welcome. We're going to give it just a minute or two, just allow people to join from wherever they're joining from, and then we'll start. Thank you. Well, I think that's long enough. We seem to have a fair few people join already, so I think we'll get started. I'm not a big fan of the uncomfortable silence anyway. So welcome everyone. Welcome to FNA's third Suptech broadcast. It's our third Suptech broadcast, but actually it's our 10th broadcast of the year already. We've had just over 2,000 people join these events so far. So to everyone here, maybe you've joined some of the previous sessions. Thank you very much for being a part of it and supporting it. I'm Anthony Harrison. I look after marketing here at FNA, and we've got two fantastic guests for you. I'll just cover some very quick housekeeping, and then I'll hand you over to them and Adam to begin the discussion. So, housekeeping. This session, the Suptech broadcast, follows a 60-minute format in which our guests will provide their expert insight into the latest developments and innovations influencing the industry. If you'd like to ask a question, as many people do, please don't use the chat functionality at the bottom of the screen. It makes it a lot harder to track and therefore to organize the questions as they come in. Please do use the Q&A widget at the bottom. Have a look for it. I think it's third on the right. It's called Q&A. And if you have questions, please do post them there. And then during the Q&A session, at the end of the session, we'll go through as many of them as we can. Next slide, please. Now, so I guess for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with FNA, I'll explain very quickly what it is we do. FNA is an advanced analytics and simulation technology company. We work across 4 core sectors, namely central banks, commercial bank, FMI, and national security. Our software is solution-based per sector. So where a central bank might use our technology for RTGS stress testing purposes, a commercial bank will use the same underlying tech to optimize their liquidity in real time, as an example. Next slide, please. So this slide actually digs down a little further into our Suptech solutions. These solutions represent one of our core collaboration areas with central banks and financial authorities. They allow analysts and leaders within these institutions to gather insight from large, complex databases through FNA's network analytics and simulation technology. So Suptech to us is actually split across 3 solutions here at FNA. We have loan data analytics, a solution that we deployed earlier in the year across Project Ellipse with the BIS. RTGS stress testing, which is a solution very much hot topic at the moment, which allows central banks to understand both operational and financial stability implications of stresses to payment system participants. And then lastly, there is payment behavior monitoring. So a solution that provides central banks with real-time visibility and alerts into liquidity or stability issues within its own payment network. So with that done, I'm going to hand you over to Adam Chabai, who works here at FNA as Global Head of Central Bank Engagements. He'll introduce our speakers and then we'll get the discussion kicked off. So Adam, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anthony, for this kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good day to you all. It's a real pleasure to reconnect with you after a few weeks. I think it has been 3 or 4 weeks since the last Suptech broadcast episode. As Anthony mentioned, we are going to focus on a very important topic, which is cyber risk and its impact on financial stability. And I'm really delighted that we are joined by 2 seasoned practitioners who are extremely well positioned to share some very interesting and timely insights with us, Patricia Mosser and Jason Healey. Patricia is the Director of Central Banking and Financial Policy at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Jason is a Senior Scholar at the same institution, and he's also a strategist at the National Management Center, U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Patricia, Jason, good day to you both, and thank you very much for joining us at today's FNA's broadcast.
Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much. So, Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much, Jason. So let us start our discussion with the big picture. Patricia, for the start, could you please share with us some information about the current focus of your work, especially in relation to the connection between the areas of cybersecurity and financial stability?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So the project that we are currently working on cyber risk to financial stability started about 5 years ago. I'm looking at Jay to make sure that that's right. Round numbers, 5 years ago. Actually, we were urged to do this by our dean. We obviously are both scholars in a School of International and Public Affairs, so we had a very public policy focus on this topic. And the idea from the beginning was to sort of highlight the gaps in kind of basic information and analytics and risk management and policies across two very different worlds. Mm-hmm. Those who do cyber risk management and mitigation on a regular basis, and those who are responsible for maintaining the stability of the financial sector, regulators, central banks, and so on. So we got two experts, one from each side. I'm a former central banker. Jay is a cybersecurity and national security expert. And we spent some time exploring what was missing, I guess, in terms of thinking carefully about this topic, and also what was missing from both risk management and from the policy toolkits, both on the cyber side and on the financial stability side. Well, it didn't take us very long to figure out that there was quite a lot missing. And so the three papers we've written together are about that, and they've been sort of a progression. Let me give a little bit of how we started at this, because it gives you a good sense of where we've ended up. I think it took probably 6 months for Jay and I to actually figure out a common nomenclature to talk to each other. That tells you right there that there was a problem. And so our very first paper was a high-level policy paper. It's available from Brookings, that pointed out how much this lack of a common taxonomy, and understanding was problematic. And we had two main messages. The main message to the financial stability central bank regulatory world was that you can't think about cyber shocks the way you think about other shocks to the financial system. They are fundamentally not the same in ways that really matter deeply for financial stability. In particular, the fact that they are intentional and timed, mm-hmm. and depending on the intent of the attacker, they can be intentionally to destruct and to disrupt financial stability. There's no other shocks in the financial system that do that. And so the whole financial stability framework that has developed post the global financial crisis doesn't really think about this carefully. On the other side of the equation, our main message to the cybersecurity experts was, it's not enough to have great defenses or even some offense if you're thinking about this from an individual firm perspective, because any shock that hits you, any action you as an individual risk manager or a company take as a result of a successful cyber attack has immediately potentially huge spillover effects to the rest of the financial system. And the size and nature of those spillover effects will depend on both the technology transmission channels and the financial transmission channels, like leverage and maturity transformation and all of those things. So it was a kind of a wake up, I guess, that first paper. The second paper, which I think we're going to talk about more in a minute, so I won't talk about it in detail, but it basically proposed a framework for beginning to try to bridge this gap. And our latest one, which is, there's a preliminary paper that we're in the process of revising, that was presented last summer. is an attempt to address what we viewed as an absolutely key and important gap in both of our first two papers. To make really serious progress on assessing cyber risk to financial stability, we need much better data and information than we have now. And so our third paper is a bit of a catalog, atlas, that's Jay's term, of what's out there and the ways in which it could be used and things that we don't really have. So that's sort of an overview of our research. We're happy to talk more about any of those pieces. Jay, what have I left out?
Yeah, just three things from my side. First, I just want to clarify, I'm speaking in my Columbia role here and not anything related to the United States government. And one of the things that Trish and I understood early on when we started this is there's been a lot of focus, like most of the focus on cybersecurity for the financial sector. So much of it has tended to be focused on the individual banks, right? There's the banks themselves, especially the GSIBs and other large financial institutions and FMI, they put in a lot of investment. And groups like the FSI SAC or some of the other sector groups have looked across at the sector-wide, but there hadn't been a lot from the focus of, or there hadn't been as much looking at this from central banking, looking at this at financial stability and that overlap. And honestly, that's been one of my roles at CIPA and as a scholar is saying, all right, all this stuff that I've learned as a practitioner over the years, there's all of these areas, whether it's human rights or international or capacity development and or financial stability, right? Each of these has a cybersecurity angle. And so it's been great at CIPA to be able to work through and helping the other people understand how cybersecurity fits, although the most fun and the most successful has been the partnership with Trish and her central banking initiative.
So thank you very much, Patricia and Jason, for these introductory remarks, and we'll definitely come back to several of these topics and subtopics that you have touched upon. Jason, in one of these papers that you and Patricia have referenced, the paper entitled "The Ties That Bind," you had provided, I think, a very interesting chart which illustrates a basic framework on order, triggers, and relationship between cyber risk and financial stability.
Hey, great.
I think that we can now see the paper on our screens. Excellent. Thank you very much. Jason, this paper was, of course, published several years ago. Now we are in December 2022. Would you argue that there is room for further channels? And do you think there's been any progress in addressing previously discovered vulnerabilities that potentially may lead to systemic crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. When we started this work, there really wasn't much else in the field. There were great pieces that were out that would look at it as a general issue and identify some of the core areas. But there wasn't much that actually dug deep. Probably the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Financial Research, I think, had done some of the more rigorous analytical work, that would actually provide tools on how to think about it rather than just here's where we see. So with this paper, which thanks to the FNA team and Anastasia for putting it in, we were looking at this because the left side, the part that says cyber risks, is more or less how cybersecurity professionals would look at it. There's a little bit of a difference, but it's not going to seem too distant for cybersecurity professionals. The right side, financial stability, hopefully for most of the people on the call, you're going to recognize those. They're how we think about financial stability. And what we really tried to do is say, all right, how do you get from one from the other? If you have a cyber risk, what are the transmission channels to that being financial stability? Or you could look at this and say, all right, if we're worried about an issue to financial stability, what cyber risks might trigger that? And you end up working from right to left, and we worry about amplifier and dampeners on the bottom. So for me, amplifier and dampeners were like, well, what about fintech? How's fintech going to change this? How's the changing regulatory environment going to change this? So in the years since this came out, I don't think we've had any additional channels. The transmission channels in the center, how a cyber risk turns into a financial stability risk. I'm not sure we've had any new ones in particular, but I think probably the most important, although there has been substantial other research since this came out, there's been really, really great work about these, especially the transmission channels. For example, looking at some Fed economists had looked at the impact of NotPetya, which was a large Russian attack, 6 years ago. As Rand has looked at the same incident and looking at the cascading failures and what was the downstream and the upstream economic impact. The largest change, I think, is in the cyber risks. If you look at that third one, external shocks, because when we wrote this, yes, there were Russian troops in Crimea, but and in the Donbass, but it wasn't the hot war that it is today, and so it's that kind of external shock that we're looking at in particular, because those can sometimes be the most unexpected or have the largest impact. The more something that I'd written in 2015 after the first invasion is the more that Russia is dealt out of the dollar economy, the more that Russian banks can't operate on SWIFT, for example, the less entangled Russia will feel, right? They would have had no interest in upsetting to disrupt wide-scale disruption against Western finance beforehand, because they had too much to lose. When they no longer have so much to lose, well, if we say, hey, you're not going to be able to play this game, the more likely they might just decide to flip the table and nobody gets to play. And so fortunately, that hasn't happened yet. The more Russia gets frustrated over their progress, the more they get frustrated with Western banks, and I'm sorry, with the West, the more likely that will happen. And so and we can imagine other external shocks like that, maybe to some degree a US-Iran or a China-Taiwan scenario, maybe some scenarios, maybe some other scenarios that we're looking at. How might those external shocks lead to these transmission channels and have an impact on financial stability?
So one other thing that we did in this paper, and as you all noted, this paper is several years old at this point, and where things you might frame differently now was, in addition to this sort of basic structure, we talked through how you might actually use it. As Jay mentioned, start on the right. Pick a market that you know is inherently fragile, or an instrument that's inherently fragile, and work backwards about what types of cyber attacks could affect things, and then the other way around, starting on the left and going right. But we also included a set of questions in an appendix that was sort of a guide. Well, if you were going to try to use this, what would you want to know about the various markets, about the structure of cyber risk management, and particularly about information about the transmission channels in the middle. And I think as there is financial innovation and financial structure changes, what we mean by the lack of IT substitutability is changing as we speak, as an example in the payment space. So the details of how you would use this, I think, could change pretty significantly, that you would have kind of a different list of details under each one of these topics. But I don't think I'm with Jay. I don't think we would probably change the basic structure, just as a sort of intellectual exercise.
Yeah, the format of which parts of we're seeing changes within, for example, IT substitutability. When we wrote this, banks were still not really operating much in the cloud. We've been seeing more on that, the loss of a major cloud service provider. It was almost what got me into thinking about this, right? If you had a cloud service provider that was too big to fail, has a Lehman moment. There were everybody's data on Friday and gone on Monday, right? It was tough enough to unwind that with Lehman. How do you unwind that? How do you figure out who owns what data afterwards? And Trish, I note in the Q&A, we had a question about what were some of the critical single points of failure in the financial system. And so since I just mentioned the lack of IT substitutability, maybe you can talk about the lack of financial substitutability.
Yeah. Absolutely, and that is definitely changing. And I think first of all, in the intervening 5 years since we wrote this paper, there has been even more concentration in terms of single points of failure. Clearinghouses are more important. Certain types of payment structures are even more important. The speed with which everything happens means that even if a financial infrastructure has a problem, even if there is a substitute, the time you have to switch is like microseconds as opposed to maybe, a couple hours. All of that makes these transmission channels in some ways more powerful, frankly. I could point to things like, well, this is IT, it's not really financial, but think about AI and machine learning and in terms of execution, incredibly useful tools, absolutely substantially more efficient as long as they're used correctly, etc. But they make the intersection of the technology contagion channels in a cyber attack and the financial stability contagion on the right-hand side much closer to each other. It's a lot, and so understanding the overlap in those two complex systems seems even more important now than it was then. I like Jay's cloud example too. I think that's a very good one. Talk about because the way that banks are using the cloud is not quite financial lack of substitutability, but pretty close. It's definitely IT substitutability, but everything is pretty rapidly moving into the cloud.
Thank you very much, Patricia and Jason, for these insights. I would actually like to briefly elaborate on some of the points that you have touched upon. Patricia, for me at least, one of the most interesting insights from this paper is the framework that Jason already referenced, which emphasizes the amplifiers and the dampeners as a key consideration to any analysis of risk and contagion. And I think we should now be able to see a table which sort of nicely puts it into context in relation to various financial stability and cybersecurity components. Patricia, now sort of several years after this paper has been published, do you think that you would add or remove any components of the table, or would you argue that the situation has substantially changed in any shape or form?
So I'm going to repeat something Jay said, which is not in here. We sort of put it, if you notice, down at the bottom of that first slide, which is the let me say, if we were writing this paper now, we would have almost certainly put something in on the dynamics of what I will call deglobalization. International conflict would probably be Jay's term, but take your pick. At this point, it's not good. And I would think that not only having it down here at the bottom of this slide, but for the amplifiers and dampeners, I think we probably would have thought more carefully and more concretely about, are there amplifiers and dampeners for things like geopolitical fragility, societal fragility? And let me be a little less hand wavy and say, as an example, how could specific policies or approaches become forces unintentionally, obviously, for more cyber fragility? So if we have Jay should be saying this, not me, so he can correct me, but if you think about the trend toward nationalistic populism combined with what's basically kind of turning into general deglobalization, is that going to increase the amplifier feedback loops? We hadn't really considered that very concretely, but I can certainly think if the world splits into something that vaguely looks like Cold War groups, the less enfranchised, to Jay's Russia point a few minutes ago, are much more likely to want to go after the status quo. And there's nothing more status quo than basically the global financial system and the large global financial institutions. On the flip side of that, if we were going to think about a dampener, Are there a set of policies or alliances that could serve as dampeners? You know, if the representative democracies do decide to, you know, end up being somewhat split off from other parts of the world and take a kind of, how did Secretary Yellen put it, friends and family approach? Could that actually protect the system more? Perhaps, I don't know. But though, if we were going to do this today, those would be things that I think we'd probably be a bit more concrete about, and those things are generally speaking not in this table. So anyway. Perhaps but I think most of this is still very very relevant. The international, I guess, is if we were going to put it in here, we would put it under international norms. If there was something, we'd probably be a bit more concrete about what we meant by that. Let me be very concrete. If the global payment system just really completely fragments into the current system we have with SWIFT and all of the international payment systems who are trying to go to a fairly similar standard, and the rest of the world creates something completely separate, that's a case we did not think about here. And it's worth thinking very carefully about what you would do.
And by the way, Trish, I think we just figured out our 2023 research agenda here, right?
There you go.
I think to further develop this 5 years on and take a look at it would be great, because, you know, especially when you talked about the deglobalization, that made me think about you know, regulation, not on the finance side, right? Finance is already pretty well regulated, but you know, European and US efforts to look at the other infrastructures that finance depends on. Here in the United States, even like, you know, rail and pipelines, and putting focus on the things on which finance depends to make sure it can operate. You know, there's been more talk now about, for example, liability for software manufacturers to make sure they're producing strong products, right? Which might help the overall stability of the system and finance sector in particular. If there's one thing, I think one of the most important things that we learned, for me, when I was thinking about the amplifiers and dampeners, one of the main ones that I was thinking about is what's the role of fintech going to be, and especially distributed ledger technologies, right? Because on one hand, it might be an amplifier because so much of it was done specifically for regulatory arbitrage, which would imply that it might amplify, but it also could dampen, you know, other aspects of the technologies could dampen because you're removing single points of failure, right? And that's the point of distributed and distributed ledger. And so, you know, certainly we've learned a lot more in, you know, the tail end here of 2022 about seeing the large scale failures of so much of that ecosystem, you know, without really any kind of blip in the larger finance sector overall. And just like, you know, to me, it calls back to the dot-com boom of the late 90s, of the companies that came out of that and the technologies and the business models that came out of that were really strong, and are the ones that you know, the eBays, the Amazons, the others, well, maybe not the Amazon, that have continued on, have given us so much strength, especially when we came, you know, to help us through the pandemic. So I'm hopeful that the companies, the business models, the technologies that survive 2022 and 2023 are really going to be robust and act much more as to dampen risk than to amplify it. That's but then again, I'm a pretty optimistic person by nature, and so.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason and Patricia, for these additional points. I would be very keen to follow up on a number of them, and I'm sure it will be the same for our audience, but unfortunately we have a very limited time. And there is one other topic that I think it's very important that we touch upon as part of our discussion, that is the central bank digital currencies, which are organically related to the areas of both cybersecurity and financial stability. And as we all know, many central bankers from both developed and emerging markets are currently working on CBDC-focused projects. So maybe, Jason, let me start with you. what do you think are some of the key considerations that central bankers working on CBDC projects should take into consideration from the perspective of cybersecurity?
Yeah, I'll say two quick things on it. First is to check out some of the material that's out there on this, right? There's a Fed paper on this, which I think is exceptionally good, right? There's nothing like I've got very little to add about what goes into it. The Fed paper is really exceptional, and if you just look up CBDC cybersecurity, it will pop up. Second is that getting the design right at the beginning. I just can't say how important it is, in particular because we've been. It's a common phrase that's said in the cybersecurity business that you have to bake security in, not bolt it on afterwards, right? That Phil Venables, who was the longtime CISO of Goldman Sachs, Chief Information Security Officer of Goldman Sachs, says we don't need security products, we need secure products. Right? We need software and hardware that is secure, that is itself secure and was written with quality and that we can depend on. So that phrase that we need to bake in security and not bolt it on. Last month was the anniversary of the first time that I've been able to find it in print. I'm a historian of this field on the side, and it's been 50 years. It was first said in 1972 that we have to that we can't keep just adding security on, that we have to write the security software right the first time. So for 50 years, we've had that lesson. So if you're involved in a CBDC, you have to get it right at the first time, right? It's the most important lesson. And if you're not going to do this to have it more security, why are you even bothering to do it, right? I mean, so many other of the models that you could say, right, we can do in other ways, right? Cash, the other payment methods that we have, we can do almost everything that we need out of CBDC. So if you're not going to do it with security baked in from the beginning to make sure that it's not just generating more crime and it's not just generating more chaos, like taking it slow, talking to the cybersecurity experts, right? There's known technologies to make distributed ledgers, right? There's known technologies to make the other aspects for payment systems. Like just look at what CPMI has done, right? There's plenty of things that we know how to do payment systems securely, and take the time to make sure that when you're joining these things, we're getting it done correctly. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jason. Patricia, would you add anything to Jason's remarks from the perspective of what central bankers focusing on CBDC projects should be paying attention? Yeah,
so I'm certainly not going to talk about the cybersecurity details, but I will make one observation. That is the cybersecurity, the financial system implications, privacy implications too, for that matter, of CBDCs are very dependent on how central banks decide to actually implement. And not so much from a technology standpoint. There are good technologies, there are better technologies, best, and those that are a lot worse. That's pretty clear. But how they implement them from a governance standpoint is really gonna matter. Yeah. Let me be real concrete. If CBDC is done directly by the central bank, literally they open up and everybody gets an account at the central bank. That is a very different case, and frankly would be a really radical change from one where CBDC is done on an agent basis by a subset of institutions in the financial system, probably starting with the banking system. To be really clear, that second case is would largely replicate what central banks do right now.
Yeah.
Think about paper currency. CBDCs don't distribute currency. The private sector does that. They hand it in as it gets distributed to the private sector, even though it is a government liability, it's completely handled by the financial system. And the banks and the financial institutions provide all of the privacy, IT, and security that's required. It's their responsibility. That's why the central banks only tend to use heavily regulated institutions to do this. Now I'm going to sound like an economist, which is what I am for just a minute. So let me put on my economist hat and say, there's another way to look at this, and that's it. Private money and sovereign/public monies have coexisted for hundreds of years. They will continue to do so. And the fundamental question that central banks have to ask is how to be sure that the balance and the protections around sovereign money and private money are done correctly so that the system stays stable. And the financial system staying stable is so the economy stays stable. That's, by the way, if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, not to make this too US centric, but the very first task in the laundry list of the things the Federal Reserve is told to do is to provide a stable fiat currency. Doesn't get much plainer than that. In the present system, that means there's a bunch of private money, think bank deposits that have deposit insurance, that over time have become quasi-public. And that has to do with keeping the system stable. It's also why banks have access to lender of last resort before anybody else when there is a crisis. My point in mentioning all of this is the challenge for central banks, I think, in addition to baking in the technology, which I completely agree with, is figuring out how to do the governance right. Because if you don't figure out the governance, the best technology in the world is not going to save you. Sorry, I'll stop now.
Thank you very much, Patricia and Jason, for these comments. I mean, I completely agree with them. I mean, we ourselves at FNA are working with a number of central banks who actually are taking a very similar approach as you have described it, not focusing just on technology, but focusing on the policy implications and governance related to CBDCs, because I completely agree that those two areas need to go hand in hand. So thank you very much for your comments, and I again completely agree with them. I'm now looking at my watch, and we are pretty much at the time to start focusing on the audience questions. But before we do that, I would like to ask one other quick question myself. Of course, one of the key purposes of this broadcast is that we want to provide some practical tips to the central bankers and supervisors in our audience. And in the context of this episode and in the context of this topic, Patricia and Jason, I would be quite keen to hear what you would recommend to the central bankers and supervisors in our audience in relation to what they can do to help to make the financial system more resilient. Maybe Patricia, you can go first.
So better data. Sorry, that was our latest paper, and it's unfortunate that there is so little information on economic loss that can be tied specifically to different types of attacks and different types of defenses. That sort of simple mapping is very hard to find, and if you can find it, it's either proprietary or it has a lot of gaps. It's the reason the Federal Reserve, in a white paper a year or two ago, proposed doing a supervisory level collection of information. The second thing I would focus on is more mapping. Like I did my little finger thing with we're talking about two complicated systems here, how shocks go through technological systems, right, within the financial sector, and then how business decisions and risk management decisions in finance transmit shocks too. Your biggest vulnerabilities are where the vulnerabilities in both of those two intersect. And so that's a very difficult exercise to do. There are groups that have made some progress. The Treasury Department is updating its critical infrastructure maps, I know. In addition, in the United States, the ARC, used to be the FSR, actually does in-depth, what I call in-depth table talks. They do in-depth scenario analysis, looking very deeply all the way down to the cyber pipes. And they've done this for the payment system, and they've done it for the Treasury market. And I think they've done a couple of other case studies too. Those are not easy things to do. But frankly, if you really want to understand where the systemic vulnerabilities are, those are two things that I would suggest that central banks and regulators think about how to do more work done.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Jason, would you add anything?
Yeah, just quickly, right? I mean, finance sector has so many advantages to almost every other sector on this, right? Even when I talk to my cybersecurity colleagues, right, they are trained, it is drilled into them. They almost entirely focus one enterprise at a time, right? And trying to get them to think about these system-wide effects of these things that happen, right? Some of them think about it, but most are so focused, right? Their unit of analysis always comes down to the individual enterprise. Right? And so if there's anything that the financial stability central bankers, FMI, like that this community brings to this, is not thinking about the individual entity so much, and to start the level of analysis on the system and what happens at the system level. So compared to so many other areas, right? This community, I don't think, has to do any major changes in approach, right? Almost all of the instincts that you have, or a substantial number of the instincts that you have, are going to be exactly right. You just have to see how they apply in this new space. For example, as Trish led off, right? You might have an adversary that's actively trying to bring you down, rather than just actors that are off on their own. And so it doesn't take a ton of effort, I don't think, but it just takes a bit of determined effort by leaders and others to continue to be making progress on this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jason and Patricia, for also answering this question. Again, I'm sure loads of very useful insights and tips for our listeners. Now we have approximately 18 or 19 minutes to focus on the delegate questions. They have asked plenty of questions, which most of them clearly elaborate on the points that you have made. So let us try to cover as many of them as possible. First question is a little bit longer, and it goes like: net zero and war are at the top of all conversations. So when we talk about key infrastructure outages caused by, for example, social impacts or natural disasters which affect the electric grid, telecommunications network, and financial system, are the various probabilities and scenarios simulated and rehearsed? Maybe Jason?
Yes, they absolutely are. There's especially nationally. Within a nation and within a sector, there is extensive exercising that goes on, less for some sectors like water. In the United States, water systems are all independent, are substantially independent. There's not one large water system. There's thousands of water systems, compared to more or less one financial sector, which is highly interdependent. There's less on international. I assume there's good things happening within the EU, but I don't know. You might see things, for example, between the financial centers, especially United States and London. We've been cooperating for a long time on that. And I'm sure right now there's a lot of exercising that's being done on European energy. It wouldn't surprise me that if a lot of those scenarios were cyber related, especially because there was a fair amount of Russian malware that was found in nuclear power plants, liquefied natural gas infrastructure. And so it doesn't take too much to try and imagine the scenarios that you need to rehearse for there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jason. Patricia, would you add anything?
No, I think that's exactly right. There is an interesting contrast that Jay usually points out between the sort of lack of an international conversation on the cyber side from a risk management standpoint. Let me be super clear here, and amongst the technology folks in particular, as compared to the international dialogue that happens in finance, both the public sector and the private sector. And those of us who are in that latter world, like me, kind of take the BIS completely for granted, but one should not. Because at least everyone communicates. You may not agree, but at least you communicate. I think there's a lot less of that on the cyber national security side of things, which for understandable reasons. But it does make the cooperation part to a really large scale, international sorts of events, somewhat less, as Jay pointed out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patricia, for adding this point. I mean, the international collaboration between central banking community is something that we touch upon in every single episode, and BIS is definitely one of the key platforms in that regard. Maybe in relation to the area of cybersecurity or generally the technology side of things, are there any other platforms where that central banks can utilize for collaboration on the international level that you would like to highlight for our audience?
That's a good idea. I don't know, are central banks and regulators all designating the technology companies as critical vendors? In the United States, they are, which means they actually have an ability to go in and do a certain amount of examination of how they do things. But I'm not sure that that's common practice, and I'm not sure that whether that's the international standard or not. I don't know, Jay. Is there anything else purely on the technology side?
Not that I can really think of, right? Again, if the U.S. does in fact pursue liability, that would change things here. And the U.S. has also been kicking around ideas on naming some entities as systemically important, and specifically borrowing from the BIS on that, on which entities are more important to others, and technology companies would be expected to be part of that. But that's unlikely to get passed in this Congress. But yeah, Tristan, to your point, I think it would be interesting if there's a role for BIS or for FSB or others to be looking at what are those, the most critical vendors that are relied on, and even just the mere identification of, I think, might be a useful step. Excellent.
Thank you very much, Jason and Patricia. We have another delegate question that I think to some extent elaborates on some of the points that you have mentioned. And this delegate has even shared their name. Thomas would like to know how likely is a Lehman type collapse of a major cloud provider, seeing as they use multiple sites and other recovery strategies, or do they?
Yeah, I'll pick that one up. Yeah, I think it's exactly hitting the point. It is not very likely at all, because again, they engineer exactly for this. Even when we've all been affected by the outages, right? But the outages aren't really systemic, right? I mean, they last a short period of time. It's almost never from attack. It's from someone pushed out a configuration change or software change that hadn't been sufficiently tested. But then again, we might have said the same thing about Lehman as well, right? So I think we can take a substantial amount of comfort in the ability of the finance sector to stay up in response to attack, right? I mean, it's quite robust. There's a lot of it's exercised. It's got people that are focused on this. We've run through the scenarios. We've put substantial countermeasures in place, but it can be done. And likewise with cloud, right? Just because they are exceptionally robust doesn't mean that especially a determined malicious actor, especially who is doing their timing right? These things always tend to hit over the holidays when there are fewer people around. So yeah, I think it would be very difficult, but I wouldn't want to rule it out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jason. Patricia, would you add anything?
No, I completely agree with Jay. The cloud is just so much safer for the vast majority. It's not that it's impossible for them to be breached, but compared to all the alternatives, there's a reason why it's a single point. It's like you put all your eggs in one basket and then you make sure it's a really safe basket. And they are certainly a much safer basket than anything else available right now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for adding these comments. Then we have another question, which is, I think, big lengthy and also make reference to some movies. And one of our delegates is saying that there are hundreds of films that show how vulnerable systems and governments may be, like, for example, Die Hard or James Bond movies. And since such films have global audiences, they could inspire hackers to test their skills for personal gains. What would developed countries need to do to ensure they are as resilient as G20 countries in their cyber defense strategy?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, there's almost two parts of that. The first part is on the movies and getting inspiring hackers. There's plenty of others. They have plenty of inspiration, right? One of the first major hacks was Vladimir Levin in 1995, hitting Citibank for something like $10 million. So we're well into that. But for the most part, to affect any of the larger banks and certainly to have any kind of systemic impact, it's almost certainly not going to be any individual hacker or group of hackers, right? The amount of capability needed, not just to take a sector down or a bank down, but to keep it down over time. One of my colleagues broke, you don't just have to break something, you have to keep on breaking it so that they stay down. And that's, again, it's not impossible for hacker groups, but it's more likely to be the capability found in nation states. And to help to take that capability, which is in relatively rich countries and relatively large banks and FMI, it will take determined work by the banks and the regulators, for example, allowing cloud, right? Secure cloud is, even if it's only moderately well done, not even saying it has to be well done, it's still more secure than most small and medium-sized banks can do on their own, right? Encouraging their service providers to switch to those more secure technologies, right? In some degree, the small and medium-sized banks have some advantages because they are relying on others to do the technology for them. And the more that we can put our attention to them to use these secure technologies, we don't have to worry about it one bank at a time. We can worry about it by the service providers.
Yeah, I would second that. I think back to the hack at the Bank of Chile. When was that, like 4 years ago? I thought 4 or 5 years. Sorry, COVID messes up with your sense of time. 4 or 5 years ago. And honestly, even the executives at the time said, look, the problem here is, so we thought, oh, we're an emerging market. We are the biggest bank in our country, but we're not a big guy. We're not a target. And so frankly, my impression is that their basic cyber cleanliness was not up to snuff. And it was actually, and so complacency, honestly, don't be complacent. Do what you can do. Basic cybersecurity 101 is something that the regulators talk about all the time. That will get you a very long way, I think, since they're not the kind of targets probably for nation states in most cases that Jason was discussing, that Jay was discussing. The second thing is the regulators, need to have enough expertise to ride herd on that. Whether you need fancy simulations and exercises and all of that, I'm not quite sure, but you really do need to do the basics right. And so what the Basel Committee and the CPMI have to say about this is completely applicable to, I think, every country that has every country in the world with banking system.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Patricia and Jason. I think we have time for maybe one other quick question. So let me look at the list, and there is actually a question which touches upon a number of remarks in relation to CBDC that you have made during the discussion. And this member of our audience would like to know how much time you think it will take to start CBDC, considering all the policies, governance-related and cybersecurity-related measures, so to be properly prepared for a CBDC launch. Maybe Patricia, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. It's I'm not going to give you a specific timeline, but one thing I can predict, I think pretty safely, is that the largest global currencies are going to go last. The central banks are kind of famous for watching everybody else, because having this be a problem for the euro or the dollar or even yen or sterling, a really huge problem that something's not done right, is going to be a much bigger problem for the global economy, not to mention for the central bank and the domestic economy. The good news is there are lots of central banks out there that are doing pilot projects. I'm almost sure they're going to do pilots. They're going to be quite limited and small and almost surely purely domestic, the way the Chinese have done it. There are a couple other central banks who are doing similar things. I think the other thing that central banks are going to do is to think about what the benefits are of CBDCs: speed, efficiency, financial inclusion, possibly robustness, depending on how they set up the technological infrastructure. Moving to real-time payments or close to real-time payments inside the regulated financial sector, whether they're wholesale or retail, for most countries, including the big advanced economies, would help on almost every one of those fronts. And so I think that's a reason, for example, in the United States, the push is first. That it's not that the Fed isn't working on a CBDC. We know they are, because we read their papers. But what's the thing they're actually going after from an implementation standpoint first is real-time payments. That's interesting. And so I wouldn't be even slightly surprised if this ends up being particularly for the big economies, ends up being very staged, right? First, you improve your payments infrastructure and make it more robust on the existing rails. Within the existing system. And then you figure out after that whether you need a CBDC or not. So I'm not going to give you a timeline. It just seemed to me that there are plenty of pre-steps, and no central bank wants this to go badly, which means it's going to take longer rather than shorter, in my 2 cents. I would think years.
Yeah, I can't improve on that answer, but just to close, because that was a fabulous answer. To close, I was thinking about what I liked about the Fed paper on CBDCs. And it reminded me about our paper, the one that we put up, because so much of the work that I've liked in this space is, we're still in the first couple of chapters of figuring this out. And we see this a lot of cybersecurity applicability to some other topic, right? What the Fed did was was basically and what Trish and I did with our co-authors is saying, here's kind of like the basics and maybe some intermediate concepts from these two fields. And in a structured way, say, here's how the two of them are going to apply in the new space. And it's a relatively basic research and analytical task, right? Of this structured way of saying, hey, here are these two things and here's that going to affect. And that's really all the Fed did. That's really all Trish and I did. And so I really encourage the participants and others to look at how they can do that themselves on CBDCs and these other areas, because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can pursue in these just through the structured analysis of these different areas. So thank you very much, and thanks to the FNA team.
Excellent.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you all.
Yeah,
thank you very much, Patricia and Jason, for this last answer, and also for all of your very valuable insights and comments. It was a real pleasure to have you at this discussion, and you have provided us with loads of very interesting and valuable insights. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And I'm sure I speak also on behalf of our audience that we all very much look forward to keeping in touch and continuing our conversation at some point in the future.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, big thanks to our guests. I guess thank you as well to Adam for expertly moderating that session. Also, thank you for all the questions as well. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go through all of them, but the details are on the screen if you want to drop FNA or any of our guests a message to ask some follow-up questions. In the meantime, we've got 2 more events before we break for Christmas. On December the 8th, we've got the 12th of the CBC broadcast. And then shortly after that, last one this year, that's going to be the FMI broadcast. We've got some fantastic guests on both of those. Sign-up details are on the FNA website. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, FNA. Thanks,
Thanks.
Anastasia.